So now Immaculée has gone on to higher education, and she's at either high school or college, and honestly I can't remember, so here we go. Life was good at Lycée until war broke out in my third and final year. It was a beautiful sunny afternoon on the first day of October 1990. My classmates and I were waiting for our civil education class to begin and wondering why our teacher was late. Mr. Gahigi was an easygoing, friendly man and perhaps the calmest person I'd ever met. So when he finally showed up wringing his hands and pacing back and forth at the front of the classroom, we knew that something was wrong. One of the students asked him what was the matter, but he continued pacing and wouldn't look at us. I wondered what bad news our teacher was keeping from us, thinking he was probably going to tell us that the nuns had canceled movie night, but it was something much bigger. We weren't allowed to listen to news broadcasts at school, so just like at home, I was isolated from what was going on in the real world. I've just found out that there's been an attack on the country, Mr. Gahigi informed us somberly. I'm afraid it is very serious, and could have an impact on all of us for a long time to come. The class fell silent, and then everyone started talking at once, shouting out questions, wanting to know who was attacking Rwanda and why. A group of Tutsi rebel soldiers living in Uganda has crossed the border, he replied. They are mainly the children of Rwandan refugees who have banded together and are fighting to get back into the country. There's a lot of fighting going on right now north of here between the rebels and the Rwandan government soldiers. Mr. Gahigi was bombarded with a volley of frightened and indignant questions. What do those Tutsis want? Why are they attacking us? What will they do to us if they reach the school? I felt the heat of shame on the back of my neck and wanted to crawl under my desk. There were 50 students in the class, and 47 of them were Hutu. I was so nervous and self-conscious that I couldn't look at the other 2 Tutsi girls. It was the first time I'd felt embarrassed about being Tutsi, and the first time I felt singled out at Lycée. The rebels are soldiers fighting with the Rwandese Patriotic Front. That's a political association of Tutsis who left the country years ago and have been forbidden by the government from returning. They're foreigners, really, and they're waging a war to get back into Rwanda and take over the government. I knew about the Rwandese Patriotic Front, or RPF, and I knew that the people in it weren't fighting simply to topple the Hutu government. They wanted to live in a country that was free and equal. Most of the RPF soldiers, the rebels, were Tutsi exiles or the children of Tutsi exiles. Hundreds of thousands of Tutsis had fled Rwanda during the troubles of 1959 and 1973, as well as the many other times that Hutu extremists had gone on Tutsi killing sprees. They'd gone into exile to save their lives and those of their families. Mr. Gahigi called the rebels foreigners because most of them grew up in neighboring countries such as Uganda and Zaire, but that was only because President Habyarimana enforced a policy banning exiles from ever returning to Rwanda. He'd created a Tutsi diaspora, and entire generations of Rwandan Tutsis had grown up without once setting foot in their homeland. Mr. Gahigi didn't mention any of that, but he knew what happened whenever Tutsis fought back against extremist Hutus. He was worried for us, saying, "This could go very hard for Tutsis. This kind of thing can lead to many killings, so let's pray that the government and the rebels can settle their differences peacefully and we avoid a lot of bloodshed." Our class was essentially over. The girls talked of nothing but the attack and what they would do if Tutsi soldiers arrived at the school. I sat quietly with my 2 Tutsi classmates, trying to be inconspicuous. My shame slowly transformed into anger as I thought about how unfairly Tutsis had been treated. I silently rooted for the RPF, hoping that the rebels would beat the government soldiers and put an end to the discrimination. But by the end of the day, my anger had been replaced by fear as I worried about my village and my family. I closed my eyes and said a prayer, asking God to keep my family safe because I didn't know how I would survive without them. Many of the students had relatives in the north, where the fighting was worst, so the school director allowed us to listen to radio reports and keep up with events. But more often than not, the national radio broadcasted little more than hate propaganda. The announcers claimed that the rebel soldiers lived in the forest like animals, ate human flesh, and consorted with monkeys. They said that the rebels had become so evil that horns had sprouted from their heads. Rwandans were warned to be on their guard because the rebel cockroaches were cunning and could strike anytime, anywhere. These reports inflamed the hyperactive imaginations of already frightened schoolgirls. One of them was so nervous that she almost got me killed. Danita, one of my dorm sisters, believed every horrible depiction of the rebel soldiers. One night I must have woken her as I slipped out of bed to use the outdoor bathroom. It was cold, so I had a large scarf wrapped around my head and was wearing oversized pajamas to keep warm. I must have looked a little frightening because when I tried to open the dorm door to get back inside, Danita slammed it shut in my face. The entire campus soon echoed with her terrified screams. Help me! Help me! Oh my God! Help! It's an RPF soldier! He's come to kill us, to eat us! He has horns on his head! I recognized Danita's shrieking voice and calmly said, Danita, it's me, Immaculée. I'm not a soldier. I don't have horns. I'm wearing a scarf. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps on gravel and spun around. The school's biggest security guard was charging toward me in the dark, holding a spear leveled directly at my heart. My knees buckled and I dropped to the ground. He stopped just inches from me. Immaculée, I almost killed you. Who is screaming like that? He said. By that time, every girl in the dorm was screaming, and I had to shout for him to hear me over the din. Several security guards spent at least half an hour trying to convince the girls that it was safe to open the door, but they refused. The school director had to be summoned with the master key. Once inside, she gave us a long lecture on the dangers of letting our imaginations get the better of us. Not all the tension in the school was in our imaginations, though. One afternoon, we all went out for a picnic and were passing a group of local Hutus. One of them was holding a big knife and waved it at me. Look at how tall that one is. We'll kill you first. We'll make you pay for what your rebel brothers are doing. My stomach churned, and I thought I was about to throw up. It was the first time anyone had threatened me with violence, and I didn't know how to react. I ran back to my dorm, swearing that I'd never go on a school outing again. I cursed my height and wondered why being tall was such a crime in my country. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't stop being tall, and I couldn't stop being Tutsi. My first 2 years at university flew by and all was well. My grades were good, my family was healthy, and my life was fun and exciting. In fact, life was so good that it was sometimes easy to forget that there was a war going on, while other times it was impossible to forget. Despite on-again, off-again peace talks and ceasefires, the fierce fighting between the Tutsi rebels and government troops continued in the north. Radical political parties were springing up in many towns and cities, each violently opposed to the other. Unemployed young men flocked to the youth wings of the different parties because they had nothing better to do. Many were just street gang members who joined the parties for free drugs and alcohol. President Habyarimana's own political party organized a youth movement called the Interahamwe, which means those who attack together. The Interahamwe attracted thousands of homeless kids, and its membership spread across the country like a virus. It became the Hutu extremist militia, and many of its members were trained to fight and kill by government army soldiers. They traveled in packs and wore informal uniforms, baggy print shirts of bright red, yellow, and green that resembled the flag of their political party. But no matter how much they organized, I always viewed them as lawless street thugs. I first noticed the Interahamwe during my Easter vacation in 1993. I was in Kigali with John, my boyfriend, visiting Sarah and her parents, when the bus we were traveling in became stuck in traffic. As we waited, I glanced out the window and saw a group of young men surrounding a middle-aged Tutsi woman who looked as if she was heading home from shopping. The boys casually took the poor lady's purse, pulled off her jewelry, stole her packages, and knocked her down. Then they yanked off her shoes and ripped off her dress. It was a busy street in the middle of the day, but no one dared to help her. Everyone just looked the other way. I jumped up from my seat and started shouting out the window for them to stop, but John pulled me down, saying, "Don't say anything. You have no idea what's going on in this city, Immaculée. You don't want to get mixed up with those guys. They will kill you." "John, we should do something, at least get the police." "The police won't do anything. These Interahamwe are part of the government. Don't talk to them, don't even look at them, especially since you're Tutsi." I felt disgusted and helpless. The boys walked away, and I watched as the poor woman struggled to get up off the ground. She limped away in her bare feet, wearing only her tights and a shawl. If we let devils like these control our streets, we're in deep trouble, I thought, as I watched the woman disappear up the road. A few months later, I had an even more disturbing encounter. Damascene and I had traveled from Mataba to Kigali for a wedding. It was a long, hot, dusty bus trip, and we'd almost reached our destination when the bus came to a sudden stop. At least 300 Interahamwe were standing in the road blocking our way, all of them looking ridiculous in their clownish outfits, but dangerously wild-eyed as well. Many of them seemed to be drunk or on drugs as they danced around in circles, yelling and cursing at passers-by. Our driver was too frightened to go forward, so he announced that he was turning the bus around. He said that we could stay aboard with him and take a 2-hour detour or get out and walk. "Let's just stay on the bus," Damascene said. "Those people look insane." But I didn't want to stay for many reasons, mainly because I refused to be intimidated by a bunch of hooligans. "We have to get off or we'll miss the wedding," I told him. "We can walk to the church in no time." We disembarked along with half of the other passengers. Once outside, we saw that many of the Interahamwe were holding machetes while checking the identity cards of people who wanted to walk past them. I felt a surge of anger and asked, what gives them the right? Damascene was worried. "I think we should go back, Immaculée. I've heard bad things about these guys. Let's walk home." "Walk home? It took us 4 hours by bus to get here, and it would take us 3 days to walk home. Besides, these people can't just set themselves up as police and bully us because we're Tutsi." I was less worried about the Interahamwe than I was about the frightened look on Damascene's face. He almost always had a jovial expression and was probably the bravest person I knew. But I saw then that he was really scared. Normally I would have been asking him what to do, but something pushed me to go forward. "Let's walk on through," I said. "We'll be fine." "How do you know that? What makes you think they won't just kill us? The government allows them to do what they want. The police don't touch them. Let's do what you always suggest when we have a problem, Damascene. Let's pray and trust that God will protect us." We stood on the side of the road and prayed, 30 feet away from the mob of angry extremists. I asked God to excuse the short notice, but we needed his help to get to the church safely. I walked toward the roadblock, and a couple of the young men noticed me and tapped their machetes against their thighs. "Oh no, Immaculée, are you sure about this?" Yes, just act naturally. Maybe you better get your rosaries out of your pocket." I held my own rosary tightly in my hand as we walked toward the Interahamwe. About a dozen of them surrounded us, looked me up and down, and demanded to see our identity cards. I stared at them straight in the eye, smiled, and handed over the documents. I could see that I confused them by being so bold. They couldn't understand why a Tutsi woman wasn't afraid of them or their machetes. They handed back our cards and let us pass. But I never forgot the fear I saw in Damascene's eyes. It was the first time I'd seen him falter, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something evil had arrived in Rwanda. A month after our roadblock experience, President Habyarimana traveled to Tanzania and signed a peace agreement with the Tutsi rebels. The agreement would end the civil war and give Tutsis a role in governing the country. It sounded wonderful. I thought that Rwanda might find peace and that Tutsis and Hutus could finally live in harmony as equals. But the promise of peace triggered more protests and threats of greater violence to come. The minute the agreement was signed, one of Rwanda's most powerful military officers, a scary-looking colonel named Theonesta Bagasora, who was also the chief leader of the Interahamwe, stormed out of the talks. Bagasora was disgusted by seeing President Habyarimana shake hands with RPF leader Paul Kagame, whom he called a Tutsi snake. He vowed that he'd never make peace with the Tutsis and promised to return to Rwanda, quote, to prepare an apocalypse. And that's exactly what he did.